General Knox's quarters also serves as the trailhead for a quick side quest that I'm about to take you on. We're going to check out the other side of Valley Creek on the way to George Washington's headquarters. It's a part of the Valley Forge Park that most people don't see because they're too busy driving past it at 40 miles an hour. The site is part of the reason why Valley Forge has its name. And here, not far from General Knox's headquarters, we have the Valley Creek, which was the main source of fresh water for the Valley Forge encampment, and so named because it flows in this direction in between those two mountains on its way to George Washington's headquarters. And we're coming up to one of the landmarks of the modern national park, Valley Forge's covered bridge, which was not here at the time of the Continental Army's encampment, so Washington would not have been around to enjoy this. It flows over the Valley Creek, and the Valley Creek flows into the Schuylkill River very close to Washington's headquarters. We're going to follow it, but we're going to follow it on the west side of the creek. And this trail that we're exploring right now is one of the lesser visited trails of Valley Forge. We have there'll be a few hikers, there'll be a few dog walkers, and there'll be a few joggers. There's one now. The reason why this is not as well explored as other parts of the park is because in order to get from tour stop 4 to 5, most people just follow the Valley Creek Road, 252, and they zip by here at 45 miles an hour. So you have to kind of go out of your way to make our way down to this site. We're standing right here in the middle of the valley from which Valley Forge gets its name. The valley is actually very, very small, thin, and narrow. It stretches out with the creek almost like a ribbon. The valley is very narrow. There's Mount Joy on the eastern side of the creek, and here's Mount Misery here on the western side of the creek. Valley Forge National Park is basically is mostly the large plateau that's next to the valley. All the soldiers certainly couldn't fit in the valley, so it'd be more accurate to say that the Army camped nearby Valley Forge and not at Valley Forge. This area in front of us that we're looking at right now is the site of the Upper Forge. Between here and the creek stood the forge, a low stone dam diverted water to power the bellows and the hammer. Mount Misery, rising behind you, provided wood and charcoal. During the encampment, a road to the forge cut through the gap on the hill in front of you. The present road, that is 252, did not exist. Bar iron produced at the forge was marketed in Philadelphia. In addition, the forge blacksmith shoed horses, steeled plows, and generally supplied the needs of the local farmers' community. And here we have a small map here. We're here. We're on our way to Washington's headquarters up here. The Valley Creek that we're walking along spills into the Schuylkill River pretty much at Washington's headquarters. At the time of the Revolution, there were 2 forges along Valley Creek. This is the Upper Forge site. The other stood downstream near Washington's headquarters. The area takes its name from the Lower Forge that was built in the 1740s. And here's what the forge house would look like. And here you have a water-powered hammer slamming down on pig iron. By removing impurities, this finery forge converted raw pig iron into wrought iron, malleable and tough enough to shape into barrels and hoops and tools. This drawing is mostly conjectural, and it's based on a 1929 site excavation and other archaeological and documentary evidence. And as you can see, there's not even a trace of anything left of this old forge. The buildings back then were, very crude, and when they got torn down, there's not even ruins left. All right, the next stop is George Washington's headquarters, I promise. Okay, so here we are. We've made it all the way up to George Washington's headquarters. To recap what we've done so far, we've checked out all there is to see about the Outer Line Drive. We've swung into the valley and checked out General Knox's headquarters. And now we've made it up all the way here to Washington's headquarters. We finally made it to tour stop number 5, General George Washington's headquarters. This was the nerve center of the Valley Forge encampment during the time the Continental Army was here. The headquarters is visible right behind me. It's the smaller of the 2 buildings. When you come to visit Valley Forge, this is probably the stop that you're going to spend the most time at. It has the most exhibits, it has the most interesting things to see. Washington's headquarters is also the tour stop where the modern visitor has to most aggressively use their imagination. The tour stop is dominated by the large modern train station and train tracks bordering the Schuylkill River. The train tracks and the right-of-way date back to the 1800s. The train station was built in the 1900s, just next to the Schuylkill River. Neither of these elements were here, obviously, during the time of George Washington's encampment. There was no train station here. There were no train stations anywhere. Trains had not yet been invented. For those of you who are curious, these are the train tracks that lead to Reading, Pennsylvania, in that direction, along the Schuylkill River, down to Philadelphia, in that direction. Now we're here at Washington's headquarters, right in front of the train station. We're on the train platform that is directly adjacent to Washington's headquarters. Now, the National Park Service visitor, like you and me, we may be tempted to look at this train station as an ugly intrusion, an ugly 20th century intrusion into what should be a park commemorating something that happened in the 18th century. But what the National Park Service has done is they made the most of a bad deal. This train station is actually not in operation. There are no trains that are going to pull up to it and unload a whole bunch of passengers. The building behind me is not used for the comfort of train passengers. It's what it is a interactive museum that tells the visitor about what life was like around Washington's headquarters during the Valley Forge encampment. Now, unfortunately, I can't take you in there right now because this building, just like every other building in the National Park System, is closed due to COVID-19. We're filming in February and March of 2021. And so all the buildings are closed, and that goes both for the train station behind me and for Washington's headquarters itself. When you visit Washington's headquarters, your chances of running into other guests go up dramatically. So I'm going to keep my mask on for much of the rest of our trip here at Washington's headquarters. As we've said before, Valley Forge wasn't the site of a major battle during the Revolutionary War, but 3 months before the winter encampment, it was the site of a small one. Months before General Washington knew he wanted to encamp his army at Valley Forge for the winter, the small industrial village here served as a supply depot for the Continental Army. On September 11th, 1777, as we have seen, The British won the Battle of Brandywine, exposing the American capital of Philadelphia. Loyalist spies informed the British that the little village of Valley Forge, which was situated here along the banks of the Valley Creek, would be a depot worth raiding and destroying. So just 1 week after the battle, that's exactly what a British strike force did. And we have an exhibit table right here that tells us that story about how the war came to Valley Forge. The British raid. Just upstream is the site of the Valley Forge, for which this area was named. The Continental Army used the forge to store food and weapons. 3 months before the winter encampment, the British swept through on September 18, 1777, and burned the forge and other buildings. Much needed supplies were lost, despite the desperate attempt of a small Continental force to transport them across the Schuylkill River to safety. The British fired some parting shots at the fleeing rebels, killing 1 man. This small skirmish would be the only fighting to take place at Valley Forge. And here we have the British strike force carrying off some supplies and putting other supplies to the torch. Isaac Potts owned this house and all of the businesses along the Valley Creek here. One of these businesses was the Valley Creek Iron Forge. It's where the name Valley Forge comes from. The Potts family was wealthy enough that they had several residences. At the time of the Continental Army's encampment here, the house was being rented out to a family member, one Mrs. Deborah Hughes. Mrs. Hughes, in turn, sublet the house to General Washington, and she moved in with some neighbors. This gives the Potts house a unique distinction. Of all of the many houses that George Washington stayed in throughout the war, this was the only one where he and his military family had the whole place to themselves. It was the only house where he didn't have to share with his landlord. We may not know who approached who, but we do know that Washington was only in Valley Forge for a few days before a deal was struck, and the general moved into the Potts house on Christmas Eve of 1777. Washington and all of his officers were as scrupulous as they could be in respecting the property rights of Americans, except when they desperately needed food, of course. And they absolutely refused to commandeer anyone's house as a living quarters or headquarters against the landowner's will during the war. This was a major sticking point for the Continental Army. After all, it was the quartering of soldiers in private houses against the will of their owners in the city of Boston in 1774 that led to much of the bitterness and animosity that erupted into open warfare in 1775. This is hard to appreciate here in the 21st century when soldiers are housed in barracks on gigantic military bases. However, sensitivity to the rights of private citizens in their homes to be free from military interference was so strong a feeling at this time that the Bill of Rights would later address it. The Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reads that no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. It's not the shortest amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but it is one of the least argued about. After the success of the Revolution, there was never a time in U.S. history where the U.S. government considered the mass quartering of soldiers or generals in private residences for any reason during peacetime. And only sporadically did Union and Confederate generals take over private houses during the Civil War for field headquarters. In 229 years, the U.S. Supreme Court has never made the Third Amendment the basis for any major legal decision. Now, the Potts house was a decent-sized house, but it was a small headquarters for the commander of a 12,000-man army. As Washington moved in, he moved in what he called his military family. This is anywhere from between 15 and 25 officers, aides-de-camp, hired domestic servants, and slaves. Washington himself was a slave owner, and although he was on record as being uncomfortable with the obvious hypocrisy involved in leading an army of freedom fighters while keeping people in bondage, he never at any time throughout the entire war found a way to conduct his headquarters without both hired and enslaved help. Of all the enslaved workers, his valet, William Lee, was most likely the slave who worked the longest and the most closely with Washington. It was these men and women who found themselves cramped into the Potts House in December of 1777. With so many people hustling and bustling about, a log annex was added to the headquarters house. It has since been lost to history and to the national park, but it most likely held sleeping quarters for some of his domestic staff. Washington's headquarters was a beehive of activity during the entire 6 months of the encampment. On any given day, the road in front would be filled with traffic. In fact, if you look carefully in this direction, you can see that the Valley Road ends on modern Pennsylvania 252. The roadway back then simply ran up to the house and up to the river. Every day in front of the house here, couriers would come and go as Washington transmitted orders to and received acknowledgments from and reports from his major generals. Inside, on the first floor, the general's aides-de-camp would go about the business of taking care of Washington's communications, which meant going through a lot of quill pens, ink, and parchment. Every report to Congress in York, every letter to dignitaries, every order to his subordinate generals went through the pens of Tench Tillman, John Lawrence, Richard K. Meade, Dr. James McHenry, Alexander Hamilton, John Fitzgerald, and a few others. In February 1778, a few months into the encampment, this road carried the most special and important visitor of all. Martha Washington came to visit her husband, as she did during each and every winter encampment during the 8-year Revolutionary War, no matter where the Continental Army was encamped. From here, it was a 10-day trip from Mount Vernon, Virginia. The journey was long, uncomfortable, and probably even a little dangerous. But Martha Washington was not the sort of lady who could be blocked from George's side. She arrived sometime in February of 1778, and she stayed until May. As a proud and proper Southern lady, Martha was skilled in the arts of being a hostess and the mistress of a household. For wealthy women born and raised in the American South, this was the task that their education and upbringing had prepared them for. Various generals and their wives commented on how the running of this command post household ran much more smoothly when Martha took the helm of it. One of the first tasks she set to herself was organizing a modest but welcome birthday party for her husband. Washington's officers and aides gathered to toast the 46-year-old birthday boy on February 22nd, sharing a cake that Martha had made for the occasion. In addition, she enlisted the help of several bandsmen in the Army to perform an ad hoc concert for her man of the hour. Technically, this counts as the first public celebration of Washington's birthday, a tradition that the country has carried on ever since. Touring Washington's headquarters is usually considered one of the highlights of the tours here at Valley Forge National Park, but that was BC, before COVID. Just like every other major building in the National Park Service, Washington's headquarters is closed at the time of this filming. I'll just have to come back and show it to you another time. Now that Mrs. Washington has made it safely here to headquarters, it's a great time to pay respects to the upwards of 400 women who followed the Continental Army here to the Valley Forge encampment. The women who followed the Continental Army here to Valley Forge are generally categorized into 3 groups. One is you had the wives and the family members of the senior general staff, from Mrs. Washington on down to the division and brigade commanders. 2, you also have the wives and the family members of some common soldiers and sergeants and field officers who camped in the cabins with their families in the main Army encampment. The third group consists mostly of people who could be found here at headquarters, the domestic serving staff, both free and enslaved. The National Park Service has given us a good rundown on some of the women that we would meet here at Valley Forge. The senior officers' wives included Sarah Livingston Alexander. She was 56 years old, and she arrived at Valley Forge to join her husband, Major General William Alexander Sterling. Lady Sterling joined other officers' wives for the camp production of the play Cato, which was put on for General Washington's amusement. Also is Catherine Katie Littlefield Greene. She was the wife of General Nathaniel Greene, who was the newly appointed quartermaster at Valley Forge, as we learned. Katie Greene was only 24 years old when she arrived at Valley Forge in January of 1778. She entertained the other officers' wives and took part in the celebration of the Franco-American Alliance on May 6, 1778. At the end of May, Catherine Greene made the return trip home to Rhode Island to be reunited with her two young children. Lucy Fluker Knox was the wife of General Henry Knox, the commander of the Continental Army's artillery. Lucy Knox was one of the youngest of the officers' wives at Valley Forge at the age of 22. She arrived at the encampment in May of 1778 with her 2-year-old daughter. She joined her husband in the center of the encampment until the Army marched out on June 19, 1778. The National Park Service also tells us the story of the women who followed the Continental Army. During the American Revolution, many women took to the road and followed their enlisted loved ones in the Continental Army. They walked with their possessions, and often with their children. General George Washington believed that women should not follow the army as they slowed down the troop movements. However, he realized that they filled roles that were deemed essential to the survival of the army. The Valley Forge encampment included about 250 to 400 women present. Some, like Jane Norton, earned rations as nurses. Mary Geyer laundered and mended clothes for the 13th Pennsylvania. Other women sold provisions to the army as sutlers. The Continental Army would sometimes try to arrest women who violated military regulations. Women who were found guilty could face corporal punishment or have themselves drummed out of camp. Also here at the Valley Forge encampment was a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes. We might know her a little better as Molly Pitcher. She was the daughter of a New Jersey dairyman, and she got married at the tender age of 13 to a barber named William Hayes. During the American Revolution, her husband enlisted in the 4th Continental Artillery Regiment. Mary joined him for the Philadelphia campaign, which included the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, and the Valley Forge winter encampment. During the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, she famously assisted an artillery crew load a cannon in place of her husband, who was wounded during the battle. Some of the most underreported stories of Valley Forge are the stories of the free and enslaved domestic staff, and the women in Valley Forge comprised this group as well. One of them was named Margaret Thomas. She was a free woman. She was hired to launder and mend clothing, bed linens, and table linens for the commander-in-chief's entire household. But during the war, Margaret Thomas, she grew close to the enslaved domestic staff with whom she worked. She formed an attachment to William Lee, Washington's personal valet, and the two married in Philadelphia. Despite the fact that they were both part of George Washington's military family, Lee's home state of Virginia did not recognize marriages that involved enslaved persons. Another woman whose story deserves to be told is the hardy Irish woman in her 70s named Elizabeth Thompson. She worked as a housekeeper for General Washington from 1776 till 1781, essentially the entire war. When Martha Washington was on the scene, it was her who ruled Washington's domestic house. But for the other months of the year, it was Elizabeth Thompson who ruled the roost. Thompson managed Washington's free or enslaved domestic female staff, as well as the enslaved cook Isaac Till. It was Thompson who also oversaw the maintenance of the linens and the rooms, as well as the packing and unpacking of the household goods for Washington's many headquarters throughout the war. Washington was always scrupulous to keep a track of how many utensils were brought into and out of the camp. Another important woman to the household staff was Hannah Till. She was an enslaved pastry cook and a servant to General George Washington. She would purchase her freedom later on during the Revolutionary War. But before that, in 1776, Hannah was legally owned by Reverend John Mason of the Associate Reformed Church in New York. Mason leased Hannah to cook for Washington and his wartime staff, so she joined her husband Isaac Till, who was an enslaved cook leased by Captain John Johnson of Bergen County, New Jersey. Hannah and Isaac had already had at least 3 children. At Valley Forge, they had another baby, Isaac Worley Till, born in January of 1778. Both cooks had an arrangement with the commander-in-chief and their respective owners whereby they would purchase their freedom, which they completed in October 30th, 1778. 9 months later, the couple had Isaac Worley baptized in Philadelphia, apparently as a free child, the first of their family. Hannah was now paid directly for her work, just like any hired staff, and she continued as Washington's personal pastry cook, except for half a year where she worked for General Marquis de Lafayette, who was now a major general. After the war, Hannah and Isaac Till employed themselves cooking for families in Philadelphia as domestic servants. They raised at least 7 children together. In 1824, John Fanning Watson interviewed the widowed Hannah before she briefly reunited with Lafayette, who had returned to Philadelphia as part of his national tour. In 1826, Hannah Till died at a remarkable age of 105 years old. The National Park Service takes note of one more important woman here at Valley Forge, Miss Polly Cooper. What was special about her was she was a member of America's first foreign ally, the Oneida Nation of Iroquois Indians. Polly Cooper was a member of the Oneida delegation that arrived at Valley Forge in May of 1778. According to tradition, the Oneida provided white corn to the ill-supplied Continental Army during the encampment. But Miss Polly Cooper taught them how to cook it for safe consumption, and she remained to care for the soldiers after many of her comrades had already departed. To thank Miss Cooper for her service, she received a black shawl from none other than Mrs. Washington. Now here's the course of Valley Creek, which we've been admiring for the last couple of minutes along the trail. And the Valley Creek flows down past the railroad station through that embankment that the railroad station is built on, and into the Schuylkill River beyond. And the National Park Service has something to say about it. The Valley Creek, meandering through history. Valley Creek flows through the historic village of Valley Forge to its confluence with the Schuylkill River, just downstream of this point. Once the primary source of water and power for a bustling town, it's now one of the park's most important natural resources. It is designated as an exceptional value watershed and a Class A wild trout fishery. Remarkable qualities in such an urbanized region. In spite of its location in an urbanized region, Valley Creek supports a naturally reproducing population of wild trout. Numerous springs from the limestone bedrock along the creek's length provide a steady supply of the cool water that trout and native stream species need. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this scene looked very different. Ironworks, mills, and other industries were located along the stream. These were working waters. Dams in several places provided water power and also created large ponds where you now see free-flowing water. The land on either side of the creek below is composed of sediments that settled behind one of the dams. In the 19th century, a mill stood between Washington's headquarters, there, and the Valley Creek. Like all waterways until modern times, the creek was filled with sewage and industrial wastes. The Valley Creek is cleaner than at any time in the last 300 years. Threats to the creek have changed over time. It was once polluted by raw sewage and toxic chemicals. Today, sediment and warm water temperatures degrade aquatic habitat, a result of paving and building on lands upstream of the park. With less open land where rainwater can sink in, there are increasingly frequent and intense floods. Floodwaters are warm, they contain sediment from collapsing stream banks, and wash in roadway pollutants such as oil. Raging waters also wash out archaeological resources along the creek, and they even threaten the covered bridge and Washington's headquarters. The flood of the covered bridge. We're still in the neighborhood of Washington's headquarters, but no trip to Washington's headquarters would be complete without pausing to admire Washington's statue behind me. And here we have the Parks statue of George Washington. And I think the best thing I could do is simply read from the exhibit table we have for it. American icon. Americans of the Revolutionary era looked to ancient Rome and Greece as models of Republican ideals. This statue, a bronze copy of the original marble which has stood in the rotunda of the Virginia State Capitol since 1796, includes both classical and also American symbols that would have been familiar to Americans of the time. George Washington is depicted as a modern Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer and general who left his farm to save the Roman Republic and then voluntarily returned to his plow. The father of our country wears his military uniform, but he carries a civilian walking cane rather than his sword, which has been set aside. He stands by a farmer's plowshare, a symbol of his love of peace and agriculture. He rests his hand on a bundle of rods called a fasces, a Roman symbol of civil authority. Here, the 13 rods represent the joining of the original states and the strength gained from that unity. Now, this was put together by a French sculptor named Jean-Antoine Houdon. He traveled to America and he stayed at Mount Vernon for 2 weeks, taking detailed measurements of Washington and casting a life mask. Washington's family believed that this final statue was the most realistic depiction ever made of him. And we can take a quick, closer peek at Washington's gear here. You have that walking stack that they mentioned. And here's his plow. And here we have the fasces. And you got to look carefully, but there's the pommel of his sword, which is set aside. And this is not the only piece of art depicting Washington with his right hand away from the sword. There have been other paintings and other sculptures of Washington, and the sword is always present, but it's never in his right hand. And so we take one last look at Washington in all his symbolic grandeur. Okay, we're still right next to the George Washington statue. Our next stop is going to be the Commander-in-Chief's lifeguard huts, which is just a little bit down the trail here. But before we get there, we're going to check out this exhibit table. Okay, our exhibit table here is a little bit weathered and a little bit hard to read, but what it does is it tells the story of the village of Valley Forge. It's important to remember that it was a small iron plantation at the time the Continental Army moved in and set up camp here for 6 months, and then the Continental Army moved away and the village went back to the business of being an iron village. And then then it closed down for whatever reason. And then the National Parks, years and years later, the National Park Service built the place up to make it look as it did during Revolutionary War times. The village of Valley Forge. An iron forge was established in this remote place in the early 1700s, as there was ample water power from Valley Creek, limestone for processing iron ore, and timber to make charcoal to fuel the furnaces. Soon, a dam and mill races, charcoal houses, a sawmill, grist mill, company store, and tenement houses grew up and around the forge, forming the nucleus of an iron village. Eventually, the place was named for the forge it depended on, Valley Forge. So here we have a map of what Valley Forge would have looked like at the time. You see Washington's headquarters down there. We would be right here behind it, Washington's headquarters. And there'd be a lot more buildings then than there are now. As a fully operational business. Before the British raid and American occupation, this small village was typical of isolated rural villages that developed around readily available natural resources. In a region known for iron making, tiny Valley Forge was not a highly important producer, however. Here you have a later picture of Valley Forge. Harper's Magazine says Valley Forge is a manufacturing place and there is a constant hum of machinery from the paper, flour, and woolen mills. The neat little houses of the factory hands are gay with flowers and vines, while the handsome residence of the mill owner towers castle-like above them. Probably there. Past all these dwellings, at the end of the street stands the old-fashioned stone evidence hallowed by Washington's presence, which is, well, it's kind of been smeared on this map here. Valley Forge recovered from the devastation of the encampment and grew into a busy manufacturing community. Wharves at the foot of Valley Creek enabled the loading of products onto the new canal. A railroad built in the 1840s provided even faster transportation to Philadelphia and beyond. But as the industry moved to the cities in the late 19th century, the village declined. After Pennsylvania established a park here in 1893, most of the buildings that postdated the encampment were demolished, creating a park landscape that, while beautiful, obscures many layers of history. So when Pennsylvania turned this into a state park,